Hi, welcome to this webinar presented by the New Jersey Hope and Healing Program. This video is another one in our series on returning back to campus during COVID-19, with a focus on grief during COVID-19 and all the elements that one might be grieving. Though you may have a range of emotions to be back on campus, it is possible that there is an element of sadness for the part of the educational journey that was spent remotely. And I realized that, grief is a huge topic, and a brief webinar won't even begin to cover all the forms of grief that you might be experiencing, or even give you much information about what to do with it completely. But I wanted to share what we know from the research about grief and some strategies that might feel supportive. At the end, I'll also talk about some resources that might be useful. So today's presentation will cover the following topics: an overview of grief, relating grief to current circumstances, and resources to cope. So to begin, what is there to grieve? So you might be asking yourself, what is there to grieve in this moment, right? Especially if you feel like you're doing relatively okay, you're back in the swing of school. What is there to even grieve or be sad about? It might be useful to reflect on the past few semesters, right? So perhaps over the last few semesters, you've lost things. Maybe something tangible that you can think of. Maybe you've lost a loved one, anything like that. And maybe less tangible, thinking about time with friends, internship opportunities, maybe just informal chats with professors or attending club meetings in person, the practical applications of coursework, maybe just even walking around campus. Those are all things that people have lost. And so when we think about grief, what even is it? What is grief? Grief is the body's natural response to any kind of loss, and loss is loosely defined. So like I said earlier, it can mean something that might seem more obvious, like loss of a loved one, a job, insecure housing. But losses also include elements such as loss of routine, periods of transition, and going through motions that are not what you expected. Grief is an ongoing process that can fluctuate in meaning and form depending on your circumstances. Grief can involve a range of emotions and reactions such as shock, anxiety, distress, anger, loss of sleep, guilt, relief, many more. And however you're feeling, try to notice and acknowledge it and not question or judge it. And it's important to know that supports can help you cope with grief. So grief during these times is more complex than how we usually think about it. Usually people think about grief in response to a specific event, or maybe people think about grief in response to a specific event. However, with COVID-19, we have this sense of ambiguous loss. And it's a term you may have heard before. You may not have heard it before. So what we mean by ambiguous loss is it's a loss that's really ambiguous in nature, right? So some people have experienced loss they can pinpoint, right? Maybe a missed special event, the loss of a loved one. But with an ambiguous loss, there's no discrete start or end to the event, and it's still upsetting, right? It's hard to put these losses into words or describe them, but many people can still feel them in a similar way. So another complicating factor is that we can't put an end date to this, right? What we're going through. And there's no light at the end of the tunnel necessarily that will make it just disappear, going from one day it's present, the next day it's not. And even if there was, that wouldn't make up for everything that's been lost. So we really are in this kind of in-between gray area. So it can be helpful to reflect on the grief you might be experiencing in order to not minimize the effects of the pandemic. So finally, we're getting to how to support yourself, right? So how can we cope with grief and with ambiguous loss? So like I mentioned already, it can be helpful to reflect on grief. This would acknowledge the impacts that COVID-19 has had on your academic and personal life and what you may have lost. And this reflection is not to be done in a way that makes you sulk and stay stuck in your grief, but in a way that allows your mind to take in the impact and recognize what you have gone through. You might have heard this as being referred to as processing your experiences. And again, that's a really hard line to find, right? Like, where do we draw the line between processing and feeling stuck in it? And that's something that, if that line is feeling complicated to you, I encourage you to reach out for support so you can get the support from other people to help sort through it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to actual resources. Also, you can practice calming strategies to help yourself when you are feeling grief. So I've linked some webinars in the description of the video to calming strategies and coping skills that you can use regularly. And get support, right? So support can come from your community, such as friends, family, people at your college, or from a professional. So part of supporting yourself can also include knowing when you should advocate for yourself to get support from your community or a professional. It's important to know that it's a strong choice to seek support from others, and there are many resources available to you. I'll mention a few professional resources in the next slides, but you might also consider calling a friend to talk if you view them as supportive, maybe going to a club meeting on campus to meet new people, whatever you would find as nourishing and supportive. So here are those further resources I mentioned. So as part of the Hope and Healing program, we do offer individual crisis counseling where you can meet on Zoom or via phone call with a crisis counselor for a few times and talk about things like coping skills and resources in your community. I've linked below the Google form to fill out to get that support. Also, our YouTube page, we have a lot of videos, both in this webinar series about transitioning back to campus during COVID-19, as well as other general videos that people have been finding useful for coping, mindfulness, study skills. We really cover a full range. Feel free to check out our other videos. And mental health counseling. So like I mentioned earlier, it can be really useful to speak with a licensed mental health counselor or a psychologist or a social worker. There are lots of folks available that can help support you as you go through difficult times. Feel free to connect with us if you need help kind of exploring that and finding out who might be available for you in your area, things like that. So these are the references that I used for the research presented in this presentation. Feel free to check them out. The Center for Psychological Services of the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology, in collaboration with the New Jersey Department of Human Services Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services, Disaster and Terrorism Branch, offers this crisis counseling program through a federal emergency management agency. This program is brought to you through the New Jersey Hope and Healing Crisis Counseling Program. Thank you so much for sticking around for this webinar. Take care.